I'm going to do a very brief introduction today because I was stayed very busy in February and I have not had a chance to space out these recordings as I would have liked. So I went ahead and recorded the final reading in three parts for our book, The Power of the Powerless, this evening for me, February 28th, 2023. And so you're going to see me in the same sweater the whole way through. Sorry, there's not more variety, but I decided that this had to be finished. One, it's a difficult book to read. It's got a lot of big words, which I don't have a problem with, but that is not, it's challenging to read and keep interesting. So if you have stuck it out for the reading of this book, kudos. And I think it was well worth it. I know I actually really enjoyed the book, and it's been educational. I think it accomplished what I was hoping to accomplish. And I was truly amazed by how many parallels were discussed in this book. Having it come from someone who was later elected a president of a country, I think is also impactful. So I'm going to stop there and introduce you to part 5, reading Power of the Powerless. See you soon. And almost never occurring, at least not in that form, in democratic societies. Who are these dissidents? It seems that the term is applied primarily to citizens of the Soviet bloc who have decided to live within the truth and who, in addition, meet the following criteria. 1, they express their nonconformist positions and critical opinions publicly and systematically within the very strict limits available to them, and because of this, they are known in the West. 2, despite being unable to publish at home and despite every possible form of persecution by their governments, they have, by virtue of their attitudes, managed to win a certain esteem, both from the public and from their government, and thus they actually enjoy a very limited and very strange degree of indirect actual power in their own milieu as well. This either protects them from the worst forms of persecution, or at least it ensures that if they are persecuted, it will mean certain political complications for their governments. 3, the horizon of their critical attention and their commitment reaches beyond the narrow context of their immediate surroundings or special interests to embrace more general causes, and thus their work becomes political in nature, although the degree to which they think of themselves as a directly political force may vary a great deal. 4, they are people who lean towards intellectual pursuits, and that is, they are writing people. People for whom the written word is the primary and often the only political medium they command, and that can gain them attention, particularly from abroad. Other ways in which they seek to live within the truth are either lost to the foreign observer in the elusive local milieu, or, if they reach beyond this local framework, they appear to be only somewhat less visible complements to what they have written. 5, regardless of their actual vocations, these people are talked about in the West more frequently in terms of their activities as committed citizens or in terms of the critical, political aspects of their work than in terms of the real work they do in their own fields. From personal experience, I know that there is an invisible line you cross without even wanting to or becoming aware of it, beyond which they cease to treat you as a writer who happens to be a concerned citizen and begin talking of you as a dissident who almost incidentally, in his or her spare time perhaps, happens to write plays as well. Unquestionably, there are people who meet all of these criteria. What is debatable is whether we should be using a special term for a group defined in such an essentially incidental way, and specifically whether they should be called dissidents. It does happen, however, and there is clearly nothing we can do about it. Sometimes, to facilitate communication, we even use the label ourselves, although it is done with distaste, rather ironically, and almost always in quotation marks. Perhaps it is now appropriate to outline some of the reasons why dissidents themselves are not very happy to be referred to in this way. In the first place, the word is problematic from an etymological point of view. A dissident, we are told in our press, means something like renegade or backslider. But dissidents do not consider themselves renegades for the simple reason that they are not primarily denying or rejecting anything. On the contrary, they have tried to reaffirm their own identity. And if they reject anything at all, then it is merely what was false and alienating in their lives, that aspect of living within a lie. But that is not the most important thing. The term dissident frequently implies a special profession, as if, along with the more normal vocations, there was another special one, grumbling about the state of things. In fact, a dissident is simply a physicist, a sociologist, a worker, a poet, individuals who are merely doing what they feel they must, and consequently, who find themselves in open conflict with the regime. This conflict has not come about through any conscious intention on their part, but simply through the inner logic of their thinking, behavior, or work, often confronted with external circumstances more or less beyond their control. They have not, in other words, consciously decided to be professional malcontents, rather as one decides to be a tailor or a blacksmith. In fact, of course, they do not usually discover they are dissidents until long after they have actually become one. Dissent brings from motivations far different from the desire for titles or fame. In short, they do not decide to become dissidents, and even if they were to devote 24 hours a day to it, it would still not be a profession, but primarily an existential attitude. Moreover, it is an attitude that is in no way the exclusive property of those who have earned themselves the title of dissident, just because they happen to fulfill those accidental external conditions already mentioned. There are thousands of nameless people who try to live within the truth, and millions who want to but cannot, perhaps only because to do so in the circumstances in which they live, they would need 10 times the courage of those who have already taken the first step. If several dozen are randomly chosen from among all these people and put into a special category, this can utterly distort the general picture. It does so in two different ways. Either it suggests that dissidents are a group of prominent people, a protected species, who are permitted to do things others are not, and whom the government may even be cultivating as living proof of its generosity, or it lends support to the illusion that since there is no more than a handful of malcontents to whom not very much is really being done, all the rest are therefore content, for were they not so, they would be dissidents too. But that is not all. This categorization also unintentionally supports the impression that the primary concern of these dissidents is some vested interest that they share as a group, as though their entire argument with the government were no more than a rather abstruse conflict between two opposed groups, a conflict that leaves society out of it altogether. But such an impression profoundly contradicts the real importance of the dissident attitude, which stands or falls on its interest in others, in what ails society as a whole. In other words, on an interest in all those who do not speak up. If dissidents have any kind of authority at all, and if they have not been exterminated long ago like exotic insects that have appeared where they have no business being, then this is not because the government holds this exclusive group and their exclusive ideas in such awe, but because it is perfectly aware of the potential political power of living within the truth, rooted in the hidden sphere and well aware, too, of the kind of world dissident grows out of in the world it addresses. The everyday human world, the world of daily tension between the aims of life and the aims of the system. Can be any better evidence of this than the government's action after Charter 77 appeared, when it launched a campaign to compel the entire nation to declare that Charter 77 was wrong? Those millions of signatures proved, among other things, that just the opposite was true. The political organs and the police do not lavish such enormous attention on dissidents, which may give the impression that the government fears them as they might fear an alternative power clique, because they actually are such a power clique, but because they are ordinary people with ordinary cares, differing from the rest only in that they say aloud what the rest cannot say or are afraid to say. I have already mentioned Solzhenitsyn's political influence. It does not reside in some exclusive political power he possesses as an individual, but in the experience of those millions of Gulag victims, which he simply amplified and communicated to millions of other people of goodwill. To institutionalize a select category of well-known or prominent dissidents means, in fact, to deny the most intrinsic moral aspect of their activity. As we have seen, the dissident movement grows out of the principle of equality, founded on the notion that human rights and freedoms are indivisible. After all, did not well-known dissidents unite in KOR to defend unknown workers? And was it not precisely for this reason that they became well-known dissidents? And did not the well-known dissidents unite in Charter 77 after they had been brought together in defense of those unknown musicians? And did they not unite in the charter precisely with them? And did they not become well-known dissidents precisely because of that? It is truly a cruel paradox that the more some citizens stand up in defense of other citizens, the more they are labeled with a word that in effect separates them from those other citizens. This explanation, I hope, will make clear the significance of the quotation marks I have put around the word dissident throughout this essay. I'd like to add the editor's note around KOR. The note states, the Workers' Defense Committee, a Polish organization that preceded the birth of Solidarity in August 1980. It was later renamed KSS, KOR, Committee for Social Self-Defense, KOR, to indicate its commitment to defending civil rights as well as its support of all social initiatives against the institution of the totalitarian state. Chapter 14. At the time when the Czech lands and Slovakia were an integral part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and when there existed neither the historical nor the political, psychological, or social conditions that would have enabled the Czechs and Slovaks to seek their identity outside the framework of the empire, T.G. Masaryk established a Czechoslovak national program based on the notion of a small-scale work. By that, he meant honest and responsible work in widely different areas of life, but within the existing social order, work that would stimulate national creativity and national self-confidence. Naturally, he placed particular emphasis on intelligent and enlightened upbringing and education, and on the moral and humanitarian aspects of life. Masaryk believed that the only possible starting point for a more dignified national destiny was humanity itself. Humanity's first task was to create the conditions for a more human life. And in Masaryk's view, the task of transforming the stature of the nation began with the transformation of human beings. This notion of working for the good of the nation took root in Czechoslovak society, and in many ways, it was successful and is still alive today. Along with those who exploit the notion as a sophisticated excuse for collaborating with the regime, there are still many, even today, who genuinely uphold the ideal and, in some areas at least, can point to indisputable achievements. It is hard to say how much worse things would be if there were not many hardworking people who simply refuse to give up and try constantly to do the best they can, paying an unavoidable minimum to living within a lie, so that they might give their utmost to the authentic needs of society. These people assume, correctly, that every piece of good work is an indirect criticism of bad politics, and that there are situations where it is worthwhile going this route, even though it means surrendering one's natural right to make direct criticisms. Today, however, there are very clear limitations to this attitude, even compared to the situation in the 1960s. More and more frequently, those who attempt to practice the principle of small-scale work come up against the post-totalitarian system and find themselves facing a dilemma. Either one retreats from that position, dilutes the honesty, responsibility, and consistency on which it is based, and simply adapts to the circumstances, the approach taken by the majority, or one continues on the way begun and inevitably comes into conflict with the regime, the approach taken by a minority. If the notion of small-scale work was never intended as an imperative to survive in the existing social and political structure at any cost, in which case individuals who allowed themselves to be excluded from that structure would necessarily appear to have given up working for the nation, then today it is even less significant. There is no general model of behavior, that is, no neat, universally valid way of determining the point at which small-scale work ceases to be for the good of the nation and becomes detrimental to the nation. It is more than clear, however, that the danger of such a reversal is becoming more and more acute, and that small-scale work with increasing frequency is coming up against that limit beyond which avoiding conflict means compromising its very essence. In 1974, when I was employed in a brewery, my immediate supervisor was a certain, I don't know what this character means. It looks like a capital S. A person well versed in the art of making beer. He was proud of his profession and he wanted our brewery to brew good beer. He spent almost all his time at work, continually thinking up improvements, and he frequently made the rest of us feel uncomfortable because he assumed that we loved brewing as much as he did. In the midst of the slovenly indifference to work that socialism encourages, a more constructive worker would be difficult to imagine. The brewery itself was managed by people who understood their work less and were less fond of it, but who were politically more influential. They were bringing the brewery to ruin, and not only did they fail to react to any of the supervisor's suggestions, but they actually became increasingly hostile towards him and tried in every way to thwart his efforts to do a good job. Eventually, the situation became so bad that the supervisor felt compelled to write a lengthy letter to the manager's superior, in which he attempted to analyze the brewery's difficulties. He explained why it was the worst in the district and pointed to those responsible. His voice might have been heard. The manager, who was politically powerful but otherwise ignorant of beer, a man who loathed workers and was given to intrigue, might have been replaced, and conditions in the brewery might have been improved on the basis of the supervisor's suggestions. Had this happened, it would have been a perfect example of a small-scale work in action. Unfortunately, the precise opposite occurred. The manager of the brewery, who was a member of the Communist Party's district committee, had friends in higher places, and he saw to it that the situation was resolved in his favor. The supervisor's analysis was described as a defamatory document, and the supervisor himself was labeled a political saboteur. He was thrown out of the brewery and shifted to another one where he was given a job requiring no skill. Here, the notion of small-scale work had come up against the wall of the post-totalitarian system. By speaking the truth, the supervisor had stepped out of line, broken the rules, cast himself out, and he ended up as a sub-citizen, stigmatized as an enemy. He could now say anything he wanted, but he could never, as a matter of principle, expect to be heard. He had become the dissident of the Eastern Bohemian Brewery. I think this is a model case which, from another point of view, illustrates what I have already said in the preceding section. You do not become a dissident just because you decide one day to take up this most unusual career. You are thrown into it by your personal sense of responsibility, combined with a complex set of external circumstances. You are cast out of the existing structures and placed in a position of conflict with them. It begins as an attempt to do your work well and ends with being branded an enemy of society. This is why our situation is not comparable to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when the Czech nation, in the worst period of Bach's absolutism, had only one real dissident, Karel Havlíček, who was imprisoned in Brixen. Today, if we are not to be snobbish about it, we must admit that dissidents can be found on every street corner. To rebuke dissidents for having abandoned small-scale work is simply absurd. Dissident is not an alternative to Masarek's notion. It is frequently its only possible outcome. I say frequently in order to emphasize that this is not always the case. I am far from believing that the only decent and responsible people are those who find themselves at odds with the existing social and political structures. After all, the brewmaster supervisor might have won his battle. To condemn those who have kept their positions simply because they have kept them, in other words, for not being dissidents, would be just as absurd as to hold them up as an example to the dissidents. In any case, it contradicts the whole dissident attitude, seen as an attempt to live within the truth, if one judges human behavior not according to what it is and whether it is good or not, but according to the personal circumstances such an attempt has brought one to. Chapter 15. Our greengrocer's attempt to live within the truth may be confined to not doing certain things. He decides not to put flags in his window when his only motive for putting them there in the first place would have been to avoid being reported by the house warden. He does not vote in elections that he considers false. He does not hide his opinions from his superiors. In other words, he may go no further than merely refusing to comply with certain demands made on him by the system, which of course is not an insignificant step to take. This may, however, grow into something more. The greengrocer may begin to do something concrete, something that goes beyond an immediately personal self-defensive reaction against manipulation, something that will manifest his newfound sense of higher responsibility. He may, for example, organize his fellow greengrocers to act together in defense of their interests. He may write letters to various institutions drawing their attention to instances of disorder and injustice around him. He may seek out unofficial literature, copy it, and lend it to his friends. If what I have called living within the truth is a basic existential, and of course potentially political, starting point for all those independent citizens, initiatives, and dissident or opposition movements dealt with in the essay to follow, this does not mean that every attempt to live within the truth automatically belongs in this category. On the contrary, in its most original and broadest sense, living within the truth covers a vast territory whose outer limits are vague and difficult to map, a territory full of modest expressions of human volition, the vast majority of which will remain anonymous, and whose political impact will probably never be felt or described any more concretely than simply as a part of a social climate or mood. Most of these expressions remain elementary revolts against manipulation. You simply straighten your backbone and live in greater dignity as an individual. Here and there, thanks to the nature, the assumptions, and the professions of some people, but also thanks to a number of accidental circumstances, such as the specific nature of the local milieu, friends, and so on, a more coherent and visible initiative may emerge from this wide and anonymous hinterland, an initiative that transcends merely individual revolt and is transformed into more conscious, structured, and purposeful work. The point where living within the truth ceases to be a mere negation of living with a lie and becomes articulate in a particular way is the point at which something is born that might be called the independent, spiritual, social, and political life of society. This independent life is not separated from the rest of life, dependent life, by some sharply defined line. Both types frequently coexist in the same people. Nevertheless, its most important focus is marked by a relatively high degree of inner emancipation. It sails upon the vast ocean of the manipulated life like little boats, tossed by the waves, but always bobbing back as visible messengers of living within the truth, articulating the suppressed aims of life. What is this independent life of society? The spectrum of its expressions and activities is naturally very wide. It includes everything from self-education and thinking about the world, through free creative activity and its communication to others, to the most varied free civic attitudes, including instances of independent social self-organization. In short, it is an area in which living within the truth becomes articulate and materializes in a visible way. Thus, what will later be referred to as citizens, initiatives, dissident movements, or even oppositions emerges, like the proverbial 1/10 of the iceberg visible above the water, from that area, from the independent life of society. In other words, just as the independent life of society develops out of living within the truth, in the widest sense of the word, as the distinct, articulated expression of that life, so dissent gradually emerges from the independent life of society. Yet there is a marked difference. If the independent life of society, externally at least, can be understood as a higher form of living within the truth, it is far less certain that dissident movements are necessarily a higher form of the independent life of society. They are simply one manifestation of it, and though they may be the most visible and at first glance the most political and most clearly articulated expression of it, they are far from necessarily being the most mature or even the most important, not only in the general social sense, but even in terms of direct political influence. After all, dissent has been artificially removed from its place of birth by having been given a special name. In fact, however, it is not possible to think of it separated from the whole background out of which it develops, of which it is an integral part, and from which it draws all its vital strength. In any case, it follows from what has already been said about the peculiarities of the post-totalitarian system that what appears to be the most political of forces in a given movement and what thinks of itself in such terms need not necessarily, in fact, be such a force. The extent to which it is a real political force is due exclusively to its pre-political context. What follows from this description? Nothing more and nothing less than this. It is impossible to talk about what, in fact, dissidents do and the effect of their work without first talking about the work of all those who, in one way or another, take part in the independent life of society and who are not necessarily dissidents at all. They may be writers who write as they wish without regard for censorship or official demands and who issue their work, when official publishers refuse to print them as samizdat. They may be philosophers, historians, sociologists, and all those who practice independent scholarship, and, if it is impossible through official or semi-official channels, who also circulate their work in samizdat or who organize private discussions, lectures, and seminars. They may be teachers who privately teach young people things that are kept from them in the state schools. Clergymen who, either in office or, if they are deprived of their charges outside it, try to carry on a free religious life. Painters, musicians, and singers who practice their work regardless of how it is looked upon by official institutions. Everyone who shares this independent culture and helps to spread it. People who use the means available to them, try to express and defend the actual social interests of workers, to put real meaning back into trade unions or to form independent ones. People who are not afraid to call the attention of officials to cases of injustice and who strive to see that the laws are observed. And the different groups of young people who try to extricate themselves from manipulation and live in their own way, in the spirit of their own hierarchy of values. The list could go on. Very few would think of calling all these people dissidents, and yet are not the well-known dissidents simply people like them? Are not all these activities, in fact, what dissidents do as well? Do they not produce scholarly work and publish it in samizdat? Do they not write plays and novels and poems? Do they not lecture to students in private universities? Do they not struggle against various forms of injustice and attempt to ascertain and express the genuine social interests of various sectors of the population? After having tried to indicate the sources, the inner structure, and some aspects of the dissident attitude as such, I have clearly shifted my viewpoint from outside, as it were, to an investigation of what these dissidents actually do, how their initiatives are manifested, and where they lead. The first conclusion to be drawn, then, is that the original and most important sphere of activity, one that predetermines all the others, is simply an attempt to create and support the independent life of society as an articulated expression of living within the truth. In other words, serving truth consistently, purposely, and articulately, in organizing this service. This is only natural, after all, if living within the truth is an elementary starting point for every attempt made by people to oppose the alienating pressure of the system. It is the only meaningful basis of any independent act of political import. And if, ultimately, it is also the most intrinsic existential source of the dissident attitude, then it is difficult to imagine that even manifest dissident could have any other basis than the service of truth, the truthful life, and the attempt to make room for the genuine aims of life. And this concludes part 5 at the end of chapter 15. See you next time.